just to feel alive. Faith and desire.
Hey, what's going on, guys? Happy 2018. It's Rico here from Sourcefind Asia. Today I have a story for you guys. Earlier last year, I would say end of summer last year, I had a crazy experience where we had to ship out $2 million worth of fidget spinners from China to Walmart in the US, and it was the deadline was crazy. The amount that the cost of the fidget spinners was crazy. We had 2 weeks to do it, literally 2 weeks, 14 days. In fact, they were trying to get them in 7, but I mean, unless you can just buy stock from the factory, it's just not realistic. So I just wanted to kind of recap the story and how we did it, because we took over a factory. We took over 3 factories actually. I barely had any communication with this client before actually working with them. It was just one of those things where you get an email and you're like, is this real? So I'll just start from the beginning. So the way my inquiries usually work is people will watch a YouTube video or they'll listen to our Made in China podcast. Shameless plugs for sourcefindasia.com/Made in China podcast. And people will listen to me talk about business in China, and if they need sourcing help, usually they contact me, or we get inquiries through people that we've worked with in the past. So I was at a conference and I get this inquiry, and this guy's like, yeah, hey, I work for this marketing company. Actually, I run a marketing company, but a lot of our clients sell on Amazon, and we want to source product. We want you guys to help us source product for our clients through China. And the usual thing is, of course, I have through my website, there's an automated response that says, hey guys, thank you, hey such and such, thank you for reaching out. Unfortunately right now, I'm out of the office, or there's a 24-hour, we'll get back to you within 24 hours due to the time zone situation. But if you'd like to set up a call with me, here's a link to my call schedule. So, I'm at the conference, I wake up, I see that I have a call scheduled, and I take a moment out of the conference to go for the call. And something happened at the conference where I had to jump back in, and then I texted this guy to say, hey, sorry, I can't be on the call because I'm at a conference, and I have something that I have to handle. And then I check my email periodically while I'm at the conference, and he actually replied saying he didn't actually get my email or my text, sorry, and he actually replied saying he couldn't make the call. So I was kind of relieved. And then we tried to set up a call, and then just back and forth, but our schedules just didn't line up. Cut to a month later, he contacts me through WhatsApp and introduced me to his team, and I got oh yeah, they introduced me to the team, and then I didn't hear anything back from them for a while. I was like, all right, that's weird. And then I got another email from them saying hey, sorry that we haven't been in touch. We've been kind of busy, and this is what's going on with us, but we really want to work with you guys. We want to make you guys into our sourcing partner. So I'm like, all right, everything sounds gravy. I'm like, all right, so let's get the ball rolling. Let's hop on a call. Let's kind of discuss how we're going to work together, what products you guys have, where we fit in the role of being your sourcing office in China. And then nothing for a couple weeks again, and I'm like, sometimes this happens. I think in any business where you're dealing with consulting or just inquiries, you get a lot of inquiries where it seems like something is going to happen, and maybe sometimes people contact you too early. Sometimes people contact you and they're ready to do something, and then something happens in their business that kind of pulls them away. It happens. So I was like, whatever, it's not a big deal. And then I one day went into the office and I get an email from the guy saying, hey guys, listen, we just got a purchase order from Walmart worth 2 million plus USD. And we're like, first of all, when you hear that, you're like, actually, no, let me backtrack. First, he sent an email saying, hey guys, can you look into suppliers for the fidget spinners, because one of their suppliers actually couldn't fulfill an order for them for about, I think it was $50,000 worth of fidget spinners. So that was a more reasonable amount. Those are amounts that I'm used to handling. I was used to handling that time. And so I go, okay, fine. So we started looking into fidget spinner suppliers. and we found a few suppliers that had stock ready, like that were worth that amount. So we get back to them. They're like, "Oh, thanks, guys. This is awesome." Then they go a week later, 2 weeks later, nothing, no communication. They come back and they say, maybe we're looking for more like 200K worth of fidget spinners. Are like, all right, or like even that's a reasonable amount. I'm used to dealing with some of our POs have been upwards of 400K. So I'm like, all right, it's fine. So we go back to the same suppliers. We say, do you have 300K or 200K worth of fidget spinners? They're like, we have 100, but we can produce, another 100 in like 5 days or something like that. And then, I go back to this client, and then again, nothing for 2 weeks. So like now we're like, look, I usually, don't even bother doing any research unless we've already settled sort of payment information. But this was one of those situations where, I knew that it wasn't going to take us that long to find out, the cost of the fidget spinners. Just because it's at the time it was such a hot commodity. I think I already had a client that wanted to purchase some fidget spinners, and they'd paid us for a report. So it's kind of like, looking at those factories and some of the factories that we did research on, and I think some of the factories that we worked with had already offered us fidget spinners. So it was just one of those things where we're like, okay, we can, if we spend 3 hours doing research on this, we can identify a few options. And then, so again, 2 weeks of silence. And then they get back to us again, and they're like, actually, the PO's gone up to $2 million. Like, it's worth 2 mil. I'm coming to China like next week. It wasn't even next week. It was like, I'm coming to China in like 4 days. This is like a Monday or something like that, or a Friday, sorry, it was like a Wednesday, because I think he showed up on the Monday. So he's like, I'm coming to China like on Monday. We're like, whoa, okay. Can you set up some factory visits? Now, if you have listened to my podcast before, if you kind of like listened to watched some of our older videos, it's easy to set up factory visits when you're based in China. That's fine, but like to hit for the guy, the way he wanted to come to China for a week. He didn't have a visa. We hadn't really had any in-depth conversations with factories. So I prefer to at least have, with our team, I prefer to at least have 2 weeks to sort of suss out the factories that are not suitable to visit, and then 2, to actually set up the visits. Because just because we're in China, it doesn't mean that the factory is going to be available for a visit. Sometimes they have proprietary products that they're making. Sometimes they have other customers that are flying in. Sometimes they take staff vacations, so like it's not always convenient for you to just show up at a brand new factory that you never worked with, like tomorrow. So 2 weeks is like, for us, is a good amount of time. And then I think for anybody that's doing it by themselves, or somebody that's outside of China, I would say give yourself at least a month to have that initial communication with factories, weed out the ones that you're probably not going to work with early, and then to set up the actual days and times when you're going to visit, and also just like figuring out how you're going to travel there. When you visit factories, a lot of times some factories will say they're in Shenzhen, right, for example, but first of all, Shenzhen is a huge city. Like, it's very, very spread out. To cross Shenzhen during the daytime takes like an hour and a half. So if they're in one district and then they're in the opposite district, it's like traveling to another city. So you have to know this kind of stuff, and then you can sort of chart out your trip. I mean, on a good day, we can visit 3 factories in a day, and that's very taxing. So don't underestimate the amount of time it takes to actually go to the factories and to go through that entire process. So anyways, they say 4 days. We're like, oh, okay, shit. Like 4 days, this dude's about to come. They want a $2 million PO. So we start contacting the factories we've been talking to. By the way, now we've gone from telling them we need, I think it was 50K to like 200K, to now we're saying we need $2 million worth of product. And we're like, dude, it's Walmart. And then a lot of factories were just like, okay, whatever. They were just like, they didn't really believe us, right? So we're like, okay, look, at least give us a quote based on the amount that we're ordering, and then we're gonna come and visit you like next week. And that kind of perked up their ears, because they're like, oh, you're actually coming to our factory. And I was like, yeah, the client is flying in from the US, and we're gonna come as early as possible next week. So that happened, and then he shows up. We met in Shenzhen. They actually had a factory that they were working with before, like I mentioned. We actually visited that factory first. And this is the first time I've ever walked into a factory, and they had like their entire sales and management staff. It was like 20, 30 people like lined up in the front of the building, and then they were just like applauding as we walked into the factory. I was just like, this is a hashtag, this is a China moment, this is so China, hashtag this is China. But yeah, we walked in, and then we had a conversation with them, and there were a lot of issues with that factory. Like I don't think they were the ones making the product. I think they were outsourcing it. They had issues with quality. Specifically, if you know anything about fidget spinners, there was the bearings problem. There was a huge issue with bearings in the past, and like some of the bearings were made from iron, which rusts very easily, and that's obviously not a good thing. It's not a safe product to have. So that was one of the issues that they had. And then they actually took us to see their factory, and it really wasn't a factory, man. Like it was like it was a room like this size, honestly, and they had a work table, 2 work tables, and they told us, yeah, we're not using any iron bearings. We walk in, and there's like on the floor there's like a pile of bearings, and 90% of them were iron. Like, and we asked them about that. They were like, no, we're using some treatment, some sort of chemical that's gonna prevent it from rusting. We're just like facepalm, and I know, like, I've been to so many factories at this stage that, like, I walked in, like, they say that they could produce $2 million worth of fidget spinners. That's hundreds of thousands of fidget spinners. They had only a tiny workshop with like 10 people in there. And then also in terms of producing the plastic, the molding, they had maybe 2 or 3, I think it was 1 machine actually making the actual fidget spinner mold. So I'm like, there's just absolutely no way that they're producing this product here. Like, it just doesn't make sense. And then I walked around, and the typical factory has signs with the name of the factory. It has warnings, it has directions, it has things about the production, information about the production everywhere, and at this factory, like, the walls were blank, stuff had been ripped off the wall. We walked into the boss's office. The boss's office, like, if you walked into my office, there's obviously personal effects there. There's other products that we've made. You can tell when you walk into an office and somebody just moved in there. Like, it was like bare bones. There was nothing, and he was not trying to be a minimalist. It was just like there was nothing in the office besides like his desk, and there was some things, like he had a tea set, but I saw the box that the tea set came in. Like, it was like it had just been delivered the day before. So I was like, these guys are trying to, like, I don't even know if they actually even operate here. I think they just kind of came up and set up a fake factory, which, by the way, is pretty common. When you're working with a trading company and you come to visit them, they will rent, or they will go to one of their partners and ask if they can use their space and put up their name and stuff like that around the space to make it seem like it's their factory, but it's not actually their factory. So I think that's what was going on there, except maybe they didn't have enough time to really set it up. Maybe they thought that we just weren't experienced enough to notice, but, like, it was pretty obvious. So anyways, we were like, I'm laughing at this stage. Like, I tell my client, I'm like, this is not what it is. This is not what you're looking for. These are not the drones that you seek. So we decided to go visit the other factories that I'd done research on, and we'd identified about 4 options. And now the thing about the situation was, his thing was they needed to get the product out within, he wanted it to be, I remember he wanted it to be 7 days, but 7 days was not a very realistic timeline. Like, no factories were able to do that. They were able to provide a certain amount in 7 days, but the biggest bottleneck at the time was that the bearings were in short supply, but they actually weren't in short supply. What happened was, one of the bearing suppliers in Shenzhen, because most of the bearings are actually produced in northern China, and then they get shipped over to Shenzhen, and there's distributors who buy these bearings and distribute, or they source them from northern China, had actually just knew that, hey, fidget spinners are blowing up, these bearings are like selling like hotcakes. He bought them and was now controlling, or that company bought them and was now controlling the bearing supply in southern China, and the prices just had skyrocketed. So a lot of factories were like trying to figure out alternative sources, and that was causing this bottleneck where they couldn't produce as quickly. So when we discovered that, we kind of went through this discovery phase when we were talking to multiple suppliers about why the bearings were missing, and like, you know, how come they couldn't get, like, even no matter how much money they had, they couldn't get enough bearings. And then we ended up, you know, discovering that, you know, some guy was the sole distributor, or one of the main distributors in the city, and he was controlling that market. And then we talked to one supplier who said that they were actually sending one of their people to northern China to like literally go and knock on doors and find a factory that could produce more bearings. So in this situation, when you're, a common mistake I think people would make is, you would think, hey, you know, you want $2 million worth of fidget spinners, let's just go find the biggest supplier, biggest factory possible, right? Which, fair enough, you know, that makes sense. But at the same time, when you're dealing with this kind of timeline, you want to have as much control over the production as possible. So there's a fine dance there where you don't want to go work with a tiny factory, but you also don't want to go work with a large supplier. And we actually found a gigantic supplier, and my client was, and they would actually just done a purchase order with Walmart. And my client was like, yeah, I want to work with these guys. So we're like, look, you can, of course, you know, but you're just not going to have control over the production at all. They're just going to take your money, and then they're going to produce the product, and then they'll tell you when to pick it up. Like, they're not going to give you updates. If there's any issues, you're going to find out about those issues at the end. And for sure, when we sat down with that factory, we were asking them like, hey, okay, we want to be in the factory every day. We want to ship out product. You know, we don't want to wait till the end of the production to ship our product. We want to ship out the first batch as soon as possible. They're like, no, they're just saying no to everything. No, that's not how we operate. We've been doing this for 20 years. That's not how we do things. So like, you want to, especially when you're dealing with, again, large amounts of money and such a large sum, you want to have control, right? Why would you invest such a large amount of money and just like give up control? So my recommendation to the client was like, let's find a medium-sized supplier who we can then, you know, take over their entire operations. And they're not going to be the best factory. It's not going to be a beautiful, you know, supplier when you walk in, and like, it's not going to have the best facilities. But as long as they're able to produce quality product, and as long as they're able to get the bearings that we need, because we needed stainless steel bearings, and as long as they're able to give us a decent production timeline and give us control over the entire production line to organize it and such, then, you know, that's what I think would be the best option. So we actually found a medium-sized supplier in Shenzhen, and we went to visit the factory. I mean, it was pretty bad. It wasn't, like, you walked in, there was just a lot of boxes everywhere. It was dark, it was dingy. You know, but the most important thing is I looked at their place and looked at the space that they had, and they had like 4 production lines, and all of the production, and these were not short, small production lines, they were like 4 very long production lines, and all of those production lines were making fidget spinners, and they had staff on the production lines, you know, producing fidget spinners. And that wasn't the entire room, there was more space in the room to have more production lines. So we sat down with these guys and we explained the situation. They said, initially they said they wouldn't be able to hit our timeline, and then we kind of sat down and started to negotiate and said like, look guys, like, how can we help you guys help us? Like, what is the bottleneck here? And they were like, well, you know, in order for us to be able to meet your production timelines, that means that we need to call our partners, like other factories, and for us to all collaborate together to do this. And they weren't 100%. And then the second thing was the bearings. So they weren't 100% sure that the other factories would agree to the terms. And then it's also about pricing, right? Because now they have to share the production costs, and they also have to share the profits. So we said, look, like, in terms of per unit cost, and this is when I love clients like this, but, you know, he said in terms of per unit cost, they're not really worried about what the per unit cost is, because they were buying them. This is not the actual figure, but I'm just giving you an example. Let's say they're buying the fidget spinners from the supplier for 40 cents. They were then selling the fidget spinners to Walmart for like $3, you know? So it was like the profit margin that they had was quite large to play with. And when you're talking about $3, like when you're talking about let's say 40 cents without shipping, let's say all in 65 cents, you're talking about like $2 plus profit, like on, fucking 200,000, 300,000 fidget spinners. It was more than that, but it was like, yeah, I mean, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of fidget spinners, like that adds up, right? So, they were making they were going to make a decent amount of money on the project regardless. The most important thing was to make sure that they get the right product and then be able to ship it out within a timely manner. So, these guys get on the phone and they call up a bunch of factories. They called their guy that they sent. This was the factory that sent a guy up north to find bearings. They call their guy, like, what's going on? He's like, yeah, I think I found a place that can give us bearings. And then they call the other factories. They give us a few hours, and we left. We draw up a contract. This is like all being done. Like, we met these guys at 4 p.m. in the afternoon. Actually, no, I remember we met them the day before, and then we went and visited other factories the next day and realized like this was just the best option, and I recommended that. And then we came back to their factory at like 5 p.m. They're making calls, we're drawing up a contract, they print the contract, like we're negotiating price, we're negotiating terms, they agree to get the bearings. We start coming up with a timeline. They call these other factory connections. They identified 2 other factories that could produce. We went from having a timeline of like, I think it was like 21 days to 10 working days, so roughly 2 weeks. We agreed to that, and then they wired the 30% deposit. And actually, they needed 50% because they had to buy so much raw material. And we had all these stipulations in the contract, like we're going to take over your factory. This is how it's going to work. We're going to be shipping out product. I think we agreed to ship out within that 14-day period. I think we agreed to ship out at least 4 times, but it ended up being more than that because we were pretty much just like, we camped out at the factory and we're like shipping out product every couple days. So yeah, I mean, it was intense. Like, this is all happening in the space of like 2 to 3 days, right? Like I've never been in a situation where I get an email from a client on like Thursday. Well, actually I have now, but it's a whole other story. But I had never been in a situation where you get an email from a client on like Wednesday or Thursday and it's like, hey, I need this absorbent amount of products and I'm gonna be in China like in 4 days and I need you to set up fucking visits. And then we're visiting factories, and then we're sitting down negotiating with the factory. We draw up a contract in a couple days, in like hours. And then we sign that contract, and then they're wiring a deposit the next day. So it was fun. It was an interesting experience. So what we did in terms of practicality was, I basically had my staff visit the factory and camp out in the factory like every day. So we had 3 different suppliers. I had 2 of my employees, my project manager, and one other person who was working as a research and development. And they went in, and I split them. Project manager was the one reporting directly to me, and then R&D guy was like kind of traveling to 2 other factories, and the project manager stayed in the main factory. And the way it worked was, the other 2 factories would receive the raw material in the morning, so the bearings and then the little fidget spinner plastic parts, and then they would make them. My guy would be checking as they're producing, and then they would ship that product to the main factory at the end of the day. And then every 2 or 3 days we'd ship it out via air. So it was pretty crazy. And we also had an inspection company. Shout out to Andy from Inside Quality Inspections. I'll give a link in the show notes. I've had him on my podcast before. We did a podcast on Do Contracts Matter in China, and he's also one of my mentors. And so we had Inside just inspecting the product, like. So it was crazy because like usually when we do QCs, we need a week to set up the QC, just because we have to book a time for the QC inspector to go. Or even if it's us doing the QC, we still need at least a week to prep and like go through the QC checklist and all that stuff. So we had a QC checklist from the agreement because they already knew the issues, and the main issue was the bearings. But the idea of having a QC company just come in every 2 days and do an inspection and then ship out the product like an hour later, and then have the deposit wired that evening, It was very very intense. And I mean, some of the main issues we had was the factory didn't know who to communicate with, because our client had a person that they'd worked with here, a Chinese person who was kind of just like an assistant, but she didn't really have a company. She was sourcing product for them, but you know, I mean, she was a one-woman show. She had 2 kids. She didn't really have time to work on the project like that. So the factory was like, well, you know, they met her, so they didn't know if she was going to be the point person or we were the point person. So make it very clear with your supplier, if you're working with a partner, who is the person that they're reporting to. Like, even though you're the client, of course you want to kind of pull back because you're not physically in China anymore. Like, my client left and we started the production. So it was very important for my client to make it clear to the factory that, hey, even though we've worked with this other person before, right now Rico's company is the one handling this project, and you need to report to them and listen to them when they tell you that we've made a decision on something. So that was one of the first issues we encountered. In terms of quality control, any of the main issues with quality control, we nipped them in the bud because we were physically there the whole time. So we're seeing things as they're being pressed, as they're being put together, assembled, cleaned, all that. And then anything that we saw was off, we asked them to remake. And then there was a few issues with molding, and on the second round, the second shipment, that was completely fixed. So that's some of the advantages. Like, we were, again, in real time fixing problems. So there was absolutely no way we would have been able to ship out that amount of product high quality if we just like stepped back and waited for them to produce everything. Like, it would have been a nightmare. So yeah, those are some of the issues that we had, communication wise, like I said. But everything else in terms of shipping, quality control, overall production management, I was super happy with. It was a very high octane situation, but like I think that all the stuff that I've done in the past was able to prepare me for that, because I was able to pull in, you know, multiple resources, like the QC company. Like, basically Andy's QC company did me a favor by making themselves available for that 2-week period. And then with shipping as well, same thing. We have a shipping company, a freight forwarder we've been working with for years, and they were able to stall, you know, like if they say they need to pick up the product at 2 p.m. and it needs to be at the airport by 4, they were able to stall the shipping company at the airport and say like, hey, we need another 2 hours or an hour and a half. And that's only stuff that you can get when you've actually built up these relationships, you know. So that was fun, man. It was fun, and even obviously it was big money for us. Like, we usually take a consulting fee that we agree on before we start working on a project, but in this situation, just the sheer scale of it, it didn't make sense to do a consulting, because a consulting fee, like a monthly fee, it was much like a retainer. It was much better for us to just do a percentage of the purchase order. So, you know, it worked out really well for us, and it was a very, very exciting experience, and I learned a lot from the process. I mean, we took over 3 factories for 14 days and shipped out $2 million worth of fidget spinners to Walmart for a pretty decent chunk of change to make in 2 weeks, and it was successful. And our client made a lot of money from that process, and you know, we worked with them on other projects since that time, and they've made more money from other stuff that we've done. So, you know, it was just overall a very, very good process, and I mean, yeah, it's a hell of a story. All right, hope you enjoyed the video. What's up, YouTube? Thanks for watching the video. If you like this kind of content, I have a special gift for you. It's called the Definitive Sourcing Guide Arsenal. It's our 4-step sourcing guide. The link is in the description below. Of course, we also have the Made in China podcast at sourcefineasia.com/made in China. Link is in the description below. And of course, subscribe.